put out a few films recently about spiritual emergency. I think we had you in one of them. And it seemed to resonate a lot with the audience. And it feels like there's a lot of people who are interested in this and a lot of people who are finding this, the concept, useful. And I think it's particularly useful for right now because there's a lot of intensity. And I think the concept of spiritual emergency is all about intensity. It's a different way of looking at certain experiences, difficult experiences, and looking at them through a new frame. So, and I think you're probably uniquely placed to talk about this because you have such a long history in traditional psychiatry and then also a real interest in these altered states and then the spiritual emergency process itself. So I'd love if you could sort of give just a sort of potted history of your background and maybe just what is a spiritual emergency and why do you think it's important to understand?
I knew from when I was a medical student that psychiatry was what I wanted to do, something about the complexity and interest of working with people. And I suppose what struck me first about psychiatry was that for some people the drugs really work. So there were some people who were incapacitated by their difficult experiences, and sometimes the medication sorts them out beautifully. But then I also learned very quickly that there were an awful lot of people for whom the drugs not only did not work, but they were problematic and they were irrelevant. So then the challenge was how to work with those people. So that drew me towards the psychotherapy training. So I did a training in analytical psychotherapy, and I trained as a group analyst, and then I became a consultant at the Royal London Hospital. And according to the paradigms of the time, I would have been considered to be fully trained at that time. So I would have done my psychiatry training. I would have learnt everything that there was to know about the current state of psychiatry. I'd done my psychoanalytical training. So I was supposed to be done, but I knew that I wasn't. That triggered a search for me. And eventually that led me to the work of Stanislav Grof, who's a psychiatrist. I would consider him to be the equal of Jung. In many ways. He was the original LSD psychotherapist when LSD clinical research was the cutting edge of psychiatry in the 50s and 60s. And when that became impossible because of the war on drugs, he and his wife developed a method called holotropic breath work. And he'd also written a lot about the deep psyche, and I think he expanded on some of Jung's ideas and developed some unusual and original and helpful ideas himself. So I find myself going to one of Grof's holotropic breathwork modules, and of course, he was teaching. The other teacher involved was Jack Kornfield, who was a Buddhist teacher. So it's a very kind of powerful mix of transpersonal psychology, of Buddhism, of meditation and holotropic breath work. And my own first personal experience of holotropic breath work was basically one of those big spiritual openings that proved to me, it's never going to prove it to anyone else, but it proved to me that that there's something that is true, of value and useful, and which is pretty fundamental to human experience, that lies behind the great spiritual teachings. And it felt so I had a taste of that was paradigm changing. And so, of course, that led to, after a big opening like that leads to some subtle changes in how you approach life. It also causes some vulnerability while you're moving away from one way of being in the world towards another way of being in the world. And so that led me through the holotropic breathwork training with Grof, which is rich and full. And one of the things that I learned with that was that it's all very well having a big spiritual opening, but actually that's only the beginning of the work. And in the deep psyche, we all have our kind of lesions, our difficulties, our traumas, over which we erect our psychological defenses. So as you go into the deep psyche, as you start moving through some of those formative ego structures, it exposes some of those formative wounds, and that I think is the work. So one of the things I learned with that is that it's a process that takes time. So in holotropic breathwork training, I think a lot of us found that moving through this more difficult territory, which is very mysterious and hidden, will often take a few years. So for me, I did the training for 5 years. That's not to say that everything is sorted after 5 years. The term holotropic means moving towards wholeness. So the assumption is that you're always working on something. So that really taught me about aspects of the deep psyche that I didn't, that hadn't been taught to me, hadn't been revealed to me in my psychoanalytic training. And the implication of that is, I think, in many of those conditions that we might call psychiatric disorders, periods of intense psychological difficulty, these profound meaning states. I think essentially that's the territory that people often find themselves navigating. These periods of these aspects of a deep psyche, the formative lesions, the early wounds, which are pre-verbal, they lie beyond narrative. You can't put a story to it, you can't express it. They're often very hidden behind our ego structures. So that was very interesting for me. And I think the other contribution that Grof made was that the areas of deep psyche as revealed by the psychedelic experience, the holotropic breathwork experience, are exactly the same as the areas of deep psyche that are revealed by the psychiatric experience. But of course, in a well-held psychedelic journey, well-held expanded state, there's a neat ascent. You have the right mindset of inquiry. You're well held. You have good ground crew. It's not a matter of shooting rockets off into space, and then you're helped through the integrative processes to make sense of it afterwards. Whereas in psychological crisis, you don't really have any of those advantages. Often the opening takes you by surprise. You have no theoretical framework. Your setting, your social structures might be very fragile. They might be very unsupportive.
And you're talking about spiritual emergency, which was something that Stan Grof probably coined the term for. Could you describe what a spiritual emergency is, or what it might feel like to go through one? Because you're kind of hinting at it, but maybe how it maybe feels from the inside.
So the term spiritual emergency is inherently problematic. I think because of the use of the term spiritual. So if you come from a spiritual context, if you start having difficult psychological experiences on a meditation retreat, then it will be seen very much as a spiritual emergency. If you come from outside a spiritual framework, then often that sort of language doesn't really make any sense. It just feels very difficult. It will feel confusing. It will feel like a crisis. And I think we can use, and then there's an issue about what sort of words are you going to use. Are you going to use a word like symptom? Well, symptom is a very medical term. It means there's something wrong with you. You're going to use a term like emergent phenomena, or that might be more helpful, because it's something, we're talking about stuff that is emerging from your psyche, and there is something that might be worked with in a useful way. So if you go to traditional psychiatry, psychiatry will look at you through the lens of understanding your experiences in terms of a syndrome. So if you do a psychiatric training, you're taught to recognize certain symptom profiles, and you're more likely to fit those symptom profiles into the clusters you've been taught. And at its most fundamentalist, you've got the DSM and ICD-10 diagnostic categories. So you're seeing people very much as a collection of symptoms, and then you might think of what biological treatment you're going to give to them. If you see it more as emergent, as something emergent, then you will think, well, how is this useful for growth? What does this show us about what needs to be worked on? How can we support you through a growth journey? I'm not the doctor telling you what is wrong with you. At its worst, I'm not the doctor telling you that you are ill and you're going to be ill for the rest of your life, which is what a lot of people hear. You're taking more of the approach of how can we embark on a healing journey together, so you can really get something out of it.
If you prefer not to use the term spiritual emergency, like what does it mean? I know sort of archetypal stuff might come up. People might feel overwhelmed by the meaningfulness of what's going on. How does it show up in people's lives for people to sort of recognise it as a phenomenon?
Well, I suppose the most useful term is crisis, and then there are all sorts of different forms of crisis, and I think the term archetypal crisis is sometimes useful because it captures an increased intensity of meaning. And often people will feel overwhelmed by the intensity of meaning, and sometimes it will have a particular flavour. Like, might have a paranoid quality. It might feel that you're in great danger. You might feel what we might term annihilatory anxiety. There might be some very visceral feeling that your existence is under threat. If that gets projected onto the external world, so you feel the external world is threatening you, then that's what we might call paranoia, which is quite difficult to work with. So the issue of someone who sees things in that way would be how can we move from this being all out there, an external process, to an internal process that we might be able to work with in a useful way. And often that's really difficult. Some people might not be able to do that still. I mean, in conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder, people have an intensity of meaning about imminent catastrophe. Your sense of the world being a benign place is completely changed and transformed. In elated states, there might be a sense of, might even be a sense of spiritual awakening, of universal love, of the immortality of the soul. In certain extreme states, people might feel that they themselves are immortal, and they might want to test out the hypothesis of immortality by behaving in a dangerous way in traffic. So that's something that you might see in psychiatry from time to time. In less extreme forms, it feels as though there's not only intensity of meaning, but something of great portent is happening, but also your ego structure is faltering. So your very familiar ways of being in the world are becoming less certain, are falling apart in some way.
So is in some ways could be seen as sort of the dissolution of one personality structure and potentially a moving to something else, but it feels like a sort of the ending of, it can feel like an ending. Yes.
And of course we're very attached to our ego structures. So there's a part of us that might feel that we want to relinquish them and move on, but there's another part of us that resists that. So it's a kind of moving from the ego structures that were to the ego structures that need to be.
And we've sort of just been sketching out the territory a little bit so far, and I'm kind of playing the journalist role, but I'm also really interested in this topic because it's something I've personally experienced and want to bring that in a little bit more, make it maybe a little bit more personal. Because I've done a lot of sort of spiritual practice work, probably dating back to, I guess, psychedelics at university quite extensively, and then different kind of transformational work. And I've experienced what I've found helpful to look through the frame of spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis or spiritual breakthrough, where I've had really intense periods of heightened experience that have varied between feeling very blissful, but also then flipped over into feeling quite paranoid, to feeling like it's intensely meaningful in a positive way, and then intensely meaningful in a kind of negative way, like this sort of almost like cosmic drama centered on myself. I've looked into this quite a bit for different kind of potential documentary work, and I'm sort of familiar with the phenomenology of it, the way that it feels as well, but also kind of how read a lot of experiences of people who've gone through similar things. And there's a few pieces, like threads, I'd like to pick up from this. But one of them is this sense that I feel like we're in a time where we're in almost like the post-secular world already. Like this sense of like the religious, which was sort of put off in some kind of walled off in very much by the materialist paradigm, is coming back into the world in a very real way. Lots of things that look very religious and sort of religious fervour seems to be coming back in. And my sense is that we are going to be tested. Like this awareness of spiritual emergency, I think is going to become even more and more important to understand, because I think we are being pushed more and more into extremes of intensity. COVID being a perfect example of people kind of being pushed into real intense states. Is your sense that this is becoming more? Do you agree with that? Do you sense that this is becoming more than just a fringe or a niche interest, and something that is more and more important for us to understand?
I think we're going through a shift. I personally don't see much in the way of a spiritual opening at the moment. It feels to me that the archetypal weather system at this point in time is not really about that. I think that may well follow.
But it's more of a descent. You used the word descent before, so I guess, but it can have that quality of intensity as well, which I think is what we're seeing at the moment. So maybe it doesn't feel like a sort of liberation or a sort of spiritual opening. It feels more like a descent or a.
Yeah. So I think the archetypal characteristics of the time we're living through at the moment. I mean, obviously in this year with the coronavirus epidemic, it's to do with restriction, isolation, turbulence, encounter with death, and something about an opportunity to look at shadow. So what is shadow? Well, shadow's obviously mysterious because it's what we don't see. But we need to look at those structures that we don't see in order to move on to the next phase. I guess there's also the encounter with death, which has been very visceral and real. Has touched many people, and so often we're kind of insulated from death in the West. We don't like to think about our mortality. It's not something that you really have conversations about or think about, that one day we will all die. And I guess this year we've all moved forward a little bit in regard to that. And if we really know that we're going to die, we know that we're mortal, then where else does our minds turn? And I think that's really interesting. And I guess we're in the early stages of that, both individually and collectively.
Yeah, I wanted to bring it back a little bit, maybe to the personal, the individual, because my experience of these states is that there's been, as I talked about, sort of kind of periods of real illumination. I've also kind of experienced real periods of lostness and depression as well. And in retrospect, there has been a pattern to it. Like there's been reasons why. A lot of the time, it's felt like there have been things that came up within my personal history that needed to be integrated. That a lot of what came up in these moments of real illumination were positive, but also there were things that were problematic or difficult that needed to be integrated. And that, in retrospect, that felt like there was meaning to it, but maybe only really in retrospect I could really understand what it was, what that particular formative experience was that needed to be integrated. I'm interested in what your experience of those patterns are, like what comes up in these states, and how do we deal with it? Are there any sort of guiding principles, you think?
So what helped you most at the time? How did you take care of yourself, or what was your setting like?
In retrospect, not trying to make sense too quickly. I think, is the key thing that I would urge people, because I think it's very easy for us to put a narrative on what's going on, whether that's a sort of positive thing of like I've got these unique gifts or whatever it might be, to my life is ruined and things are over, or whatever that, like, to try and make sense of things too quickly, or to try and attach a narrative to something that maybe we're not fully perceiving. That would be one of the main ones, I think.
And were you functioning okay in the external world when you were going through all this, or was that quite difficult, as Jung found?
I don't think I had an experience quite as intense as the one that Jung talks about, because I know that he was pretty much incapacitated for many years. But also what was very interesting in that was that the kind of visions that he seemed to be troubled by seemed to kind of prefigure the First World War in some way.
Yeah.
That he was maybe connected up to the world psyche in a way that he found very difficult to integrate. Which is also, I think, partly a problem that comes in these opening experiences, which is what's mine and what's collective. Are we actually picking up stuff that's personally ours, or are we picking up stuff that's actually kind of part of the collective psyche and things become quite difficult to differentiate, maybe?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think what often happens in these periods of crisis is that as you break open, if you like, you're accessing your own inner world, your own your personal unconscious, and what lies in there, with all its complexity and all the unprocessed emotions that go with that. Often shame is a big one there, but also as your ego structures break open, you're opening yourself to the collective unconscious. Of course, the collective unconscious is not part of the vocabulary of the medical and scientific establishment, but those who work in this territory seem to find it a very useful concept. There's a certain transpersonal territory about it.
And that's maybe why this period, like the coronavirus and this period, feels very... it feels tangible, like the sense of the collective consciousness, because of this sort of singular event that we're all going through, feels incredibly tangible right now, and feels like it is something that maybe a lot of people may be feeling intensely for the first time, which is what I think I was maybe hinting at as the period that we're going through has this quality that is illuminated by this concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting thing to think about, but it's the collective crisis also holds an opportunity, and what is the nature of the tectonic plates of our collective unconscious that are shifting, and we might see the task ahead that we need to unite in a way that is helpful to the survival of the species and the planet. But it also needs to be held. The setting needs to be secure so we can do the integrative work that we need to do. And I guess that's where we are at the moment. How can we foster the right mindset? How can we think about how we can come through this in a good way? How can we lean into it with a spirit of curiosity? How can it be a healing crisis? One of
the reasons that I wanted to share a little bit more about my personal history is I've seen this topic discussed every now and again. There was a film, Crazy Wise, that came out like a few years ago. But whenever I see the case studies of people who've gone through these experiences, they seem to be like the guy in Crazy Wise was really pretty down and out. He wasn't doing well. He had these kind of experiences that he found very difficult to integrate, and was in a pretty poor way. And I feel like it's more important because in my experience they've been difficult, but they've actually made me much more They've made me the person that I am, and I feel the inspirational quality that I've glimpsed in those moments has actually become more and more part of my life as I've been able to integrate it. And I actually wanted to sort of show that it's that there is a potentially more whole, more complete place on the other side of that, and that for me is something that I don't think is enough. I don't think it's reflected enough, or I don't see it reflected enough.
But you're working really hard on your integration, and it seems that a lot of your adult life has been an integrative journey, and you're taking it really seriously. And I guess I'm kind of the same. And here we are, and we're talking about integration, and we're trying to make sense of things, our personal experiences, what's going on around us, and it's hard work, and it takes a long time. And for a lot of people, for whatever reason, it's a difficult journey. So there's a whole load of questions there about what more can be done to help people with this integrative journey. It's not a few weeks, it's not a few months. It's an ongoing process.
Which is the paradox of. Again, we don't really have a better word than spirituality for it. I find it kind of a bit of a tired, played out word generally, but the realization that it's not a panacea, that for example, you look at kind of the way that mindfulness or psychedelics are now being kind of introduced into the culture, and a lot of concerns that people have is that they're being used as palliatives, or they're being put into a system where the idea is you take this pill, you feel better. Whereas what actually happens is you take this pill, or you do this kind of meditation retreat, and what you may find is that you're actually starting to uncover stuff that you need to work on that you've never encountered before. And this kind of realization that it's a wholly different frame that we're bringing in with a lot of these practices and a lot of this knowledge. And I guess one of the things that I'm keen to do with Rebel Wisdom, and I know you're keen to do with your work, is to kind of give people a little bit more guidance, a little bit more support, or a little bit more understanding of that process. Because in a way, once you start that, it's very difficult to go back. We sort of turn up I look at it as almost like turning up the volume on our experience. You assume that people kind of maybe assume that a spiritual awakening, or it's sort of turning up the dial on just the good stuff. It's like, no, once you turn up the dial, you're turning up the dial on absolutely everything, the whole kind of 360 degrees of everything.
So there was a German theologian called Rudolf Otto many years ago who introduced the term numinous, and he said very clearly, and he said the sense of a sacred, that deeply felt feeling of sense of a sacred, which underlies all religious experience, has a light side and a dark side. Can have a beautiful, spiritual, joyful, ecstatic, cosmic union quality, or it can have a nightmarish, terrifying quality, which I suppose we capture when we see horror films. I mean, I don't see horror films, but I think that's one of the draw of horror films, that it pulls you towards the numinous in some sort of way. And what Otto found was that if people are supported through the more nightmarish aspects of numinous experience, then it kind of unfolds, and something is released. There's a natural process about it. But of course, in real life, it's so much more difficult than that. It's much messier, much more complicated. It's rarely a clean process for people going through crisis. In expanded state journeys, it often is that sort of process.
Yeah, and the other part of that process often is that we become more uncomfortable with things that we'd made peace with, or we were comfortable with before, like certain friendships or certain situations in our lives that we were suboptimal, but we were sort of making do. And suddenly, as we start to kind of go on that process, we realize that it's intolerable now. Like those little lies that we told to ourselves suddenly become intolerable. And that process, I think, is something that all of this kind of work that we've talked about starts to unlock as well.
Yeah. So if change happens in a slow, supported context, the adjustments that you mentioned, are much easier if it happens quite suddenly. If there's a sudden opening, if there's a rapid opening, the changes happen much more quickly. Then it's a lot more disruptive.
And I wonder if you have any more thoughts or tips that you think are important for people to know who maybe have had or are having experiences like this, or know people who've had experiences like this.
So the most important thing is safety. So keep yourself safe. Find good people to be with. Make sure the environment is okay and tolerable, because anyone who's going through this sort of experience feels thin-skinned if you feel vulnerable. So somewhere gentle, which is tolerable, so you can maybe even start to do the inner work, which is part of the process. And it's so helpful to know that it is potentially a healing journey, and that the stuff which is coming out, you might call it symptoms, is not an expression of disease, but it's an expression of material that needs to be worked with. And I think that message of hope is so fundamental. And that so many people have been through it before you, that it might feel shameful. And often it does, because you're not functioning so well. But it has a value. And then it's important to find ways of getting through it. So what are the ways of getting through it? Well, the sort of tools that people find helpful are physical activity, might be nature, gardening, mindfulness, using art as a method of integration, listening to music.
Journaling sometimes.
Journaling, yes. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's something about articulating our experience that seems to allow it to settle in our psyche.
But it's so difficult, because on one hand, you're leaning into what's coming out, and it's useful, and you want to make sense of it at some stage, even if at the moment it seems insensible. But at the same time, you have to manage yourself. You have to manage yourself. So your defences are opening. But at the same time, you need those defences so you can get through the day. I mean, the ideal environment would be an environment where you really are looked after, so you can go deeper into what it is that you're going into. But these environments are very difficult to find.
And what's the clash that, as someone who was in traditional psychiatry for so many years, what's the clash that happens between this and the traditional kind of model, which can often misunderstand or misdiagnose situations like this?
Well, so when I first went into psychiatry, we still had the old asylums, and in some ways the old asylums were quite nice places to go and have your crisis. You could go there for a period of time. Psychiatrists in those days would watch and wait. So generally they'd be quite hesitant about medication unless there was a very clear indication for it. So you could kind of have an old-fashioned breakdown in a reasonable environment, an old asylum with beautiful grounds. Hopefully the staff would be kind to you, because that's a crucial ingredient. And you could take your time. And most psychiatrists were not in a hurry to give you a diagnostic label. They were not in a hurry to give you medication. Hopefully you would emerge from that having had the rest and support you need. Of course, those days are completely gone. In these days, there's no sense of asylum. If you go into hospital wards are much more disturbed. They're not quiet places where you can do your integrative work. More recently, there's been a lot more pressure on psychiatrists in training to make diagnoses, to give medication, which is supposed to be an evidence-based model. Some of the evidence-based model was wrong. So some of the things we were taught are wrong. So, for example, I was taught that if somebody's got psychotic symptoms, they need to take antipsychotics for 2 years, and hopefully they won't develop long-term schizophrenia. So we now know that long-term use of antipsychotics causes dopamine receptor supersensitivity, which causes additional problems. So in our attempts to help, we were actually making things worse. I'm afraid psychiatry's got quite a history of that. The people given these treatments are generally really good people, who've gone into the mental health profession because, that's the way they want to make a difference. They might have their own experience of members in their family with, with psychological difficulties, which adds to their vocation. But it's such a difficult subject, and some of the tools that we have been very limited. Modern psychiatry, we are seeing more crisis teams. We're seeing approaches like open dialogue, which is a real step forward. Which is an attempt to figure out what is in the shadow. What's going on behind the scenes, by getting together the friends and family of a person, seeing people very much as being part of a complex system of relationships rather than an individual.
Because there is a sort of perspective that there's a fundamental sort of clash of paradigms here, and the materialist model just doesn't understand, has no place for spirituality, has no place for the idea of spiritual emergency. Therefore, it always gets it wrong. Is that too much of a simplification, do you think?
I think there is a fundamental paradigm clash that is going to be difficult for some people. I think there is a way in which the paradigms can come together. As an example of paradigm clash, these days if people, for many years now, if people are feeling unhappy, they'll go to their GP, they'll be put on antidepressants. So that colludes with the notion that it's not your responsibility to work on problems. You're ill, you have a condition, here's some medicine that will make it better. The paradigm that we're talking about is fundamentally different. That we do need to tolerate some discomfort. That the discomfort is useful, and it is our job to work on it. There's some stuff there that is useful, and that we need to think about, which is a fundamentally different paradigm. Now, in my experience, the vast majority of people would prefer to go for the first model. That we don't really want to think about it. We just want to feel better. That's how most of us live our lives. So it feels as though there's a huge, there's potentially a huge paradigm shift that we all need to go through. Are we edging towards that paradigm shift? Well, it's possible that we might be. That might be one of the fruits of the psychedelic research, for example. That in a way it's training a whole new generation of therapists, of health workers to be with people in a different way. That you're sitting with people, you're supporting people. You're not going to do the integrative work while people are in an expanded state, but you're going to do that work later. So if you think forward to a time when there'll be more people with that paradigm working in mental health, I think perhaps we can feel a little more optimistic.
I mean, one of the questions that comes up talking about this, and I think one of the reasons that it's quite difficult to talk about is there a clear dividing line between kind of spiritual emergency and mental illness? Because some people obviously are on psychiatric drugs. Some people they work very well for. They're in really bad way if they come off their drugs. And you've got to be kind of mindful that you're not putting out a message just saying, well, actually all of this is just spiritual emergency and it's being misdiagnosed, and to make a sort of blanket comment like that.
Yeah. So I think what we're moving towards is moving away from labels. So in some ways that hopefully that question will lose its meaning, because we'll be working with people and what they bring us. Having said that, I think anyone who works in psychiatry or mental health will know that there are some people whose constellation of symptoms would fit the model of, say, bipolar disorder, or very occasionally, because it's a rare condition, what might be called schizophrenia. But that's the extreme end of the spectrum, and the vast majority of people are just people who are having some experiences which I find uncomfortable and difficult to deal with. And if you want to, if you see things through the lens of the diagnostic categories, you can find a way of fitting people into the diagnostic categories and even prescribing a medication based on that diagnosis. But that doesn't seem to be growth. But it's often perceived as unhelpful. Very many people attending psychiatric clinics who feel that the psychiatric model works for them, the medication works for them, helps keep them stable. Sometimes it maybe stops people from thinking about things that maybe they should be thinking about. Sometimes the medication gives people the stability that they need, so maybe they can do what they need to do, advance in life in whichever way. So it's such a hugely complicated area that if anyone gives you a straight and simple answer, then then often that's not helpful. So we want to move away from reductionism, from more fundamentalist approaches.
Rebel Wisdom isn't only about the ideas in the films, it's also about how we bring them into our lives, which is why over the last few months we've invested in developing the Rebel Wisdom community, our digital campfire. We've launched a new platform for discussion and connection, started regular meetups and practice sessions for members, plus Q&As with some of the amazing interviewees we've had on the channel, and our Wisdom Gym with some of the biggest names in growth and transformation. So if you'd like to support Rebel Wisdom to help us continue to make films and to find the others, maybe think about joining the Rebel Wisdom community. Thank you for watching.